Have you ever heard that anyone who's been diagnosed with schizophrenia has got to be put on antipsychotic drugs and probably stay on them for the rest of their lives? Well, the World Health Organization tells us a different story. They found that in third world countries with limited or no access to these drugs had a much higher rate of recovery, I'm talking full recovery, than their counterparts in North America or in Europe. That is, until they gained access to these drugs, at which point recovery rates fell to the very low levels that we find here. Are these drugs really the only answer? Today we're going to turn to the herbal database for some alternative answers, and we're going to start out by exploring what actually causes schizophrenia, what's its pathology, what are some of the effects of these antipsychotic drugs, and then finally we're going to get into some alternative treatments. I guess I should also add that schizophrenia isn't that uncommon. It's one of the most prevalent psychotic diseases, and it's been the focus of research for as long as it's had a name. Yet there are a number of roadblocks in technology, experimental design, industry bias that have kept it as one of the least understood disorders of our time. About 1% of the adults in the United States have it, and about 7 or 8 people out of every 1,000 will have it in their lifetime, according to the U.S. National Institute of Mental Health. There was a study published in the American Journal of Psychiatry that concluded that the term schizophrenia actually encompasses 8 genetically distinct disorders, not just one. So it can be understood also that it often goes undiagnosed. And the median time is 74 weeks before diagnosis. It's believed the longer people go without treatment, the more difficult it is to bring about the best outcome. We should be very wary of seeing a schizophrenic person as someone with a kind of deficiency. It may be just another part of what it means to be human. A person might simply process language differently or ruminate on social interactions for too long. His or her inner speech might be more fragmented or circuitous. Let's open the database now and take a look at what causes schizophrenia. Probably the most important point to make as we go through all of this is to remember that schizophrenia isn't necessarily just about neurons or synapses. It's really about the people it affects. It affects males more than females, and usually turns up around the ages of 18, 19 to the early 20s, but sometimes it does manifest in early childhood. In early childhood schizophrenia, there's research indicating that glial cell dysfunction could be the basis for it. Now, the glial cells are a type of brain cell that helps nerve cells build and maintain healthy and effective communication networks. They seem to be a primary contributor to the disease in early childhood. Is it genetic? In the last 10 years, genetic investigations have been plagued by an ever-increasing number of mutations found in patients with this disease. Research published in 2013 showed that a single genomic pathway turns out to be kind of a central intersection point for multiple pathways involving over 100 genes that are believed to be involved in schizophrenia. And so the research showed that there is a common dysregulated gene program that can impact over 1,000 genes. When even one of the many schizophrenia-linked genes undergoes mutation, by affecting this pathway, it throws off the development of the brain as a whole, kind of the way an entire orchestra can be affected by a single musician playing one wrong note. The brain takes a long time to develop. In fact, it's not considered fully developed until we get into our mid-20s. During our teenage years, there's a process going on called synaptic pruning. So normally, pruning gets rid of excess connections that we don't need any longer. It streamlines our brain for optimal performance, and everybody goes through it as they move into adulthood. But a gene that contributes to synaptic pruning can increase a person's risk of schizophrenia if certain mutations cause things to go wrong, and somehow this biological process gets miscalibrated and removes way too many synapses. Versions of the gene involved may trigger runaway pruning of the teenage brain's still maturing communications infrastructure. Something about this process of maturation, if it goes wrong, results in brain wiring that can no longer perform some of the basic functions that it used to be able to perform. The gene that's been implicated is the C4 gene, and it normally acts as a regulator of the immune system. It helps target debris, viruses, and other pathogens for destruction by immune cells. Since earlier research had linked it to schizophrenia, that led some to believe that this mental disorder could be caused by some sort of virus or infection. However, recent research has revealed that the gene also moonlights in synaptic pruning, playing a role in the process by tagging synapses for elimination. There are a couple of major models for schizophrenia. One of them has to do with the dopamine receptors, the dopaminergic model, and the other one has to do with another set of receptors called the NMDA receptors. And we'll get into those models in just a minute, but first, let's look at the symptoms of schizophrenia. These are divided into 3 different categories. The first one's called positive symptoms, and what that means is it's an excess or distortion of normal functions. For example, in this category we have delusions, hallucinations, disorganized thought and speech, and grossly disorganized or catatonic behavior. Then we have the negative symptoms, and here we have a decline in or a complete loss of normal functions. So examples would be poverty of speech, a lack of motivation, an inability to experience pleasure, anhedonia, lack of desire to form relationships, a diminished emotional expression. And the third category deals with cognitive symptoms, and this is considered a key component of schizophrenia, and these symptoms can be the first to show up. So here we have problems with attention, with certain types of memory, executive functions, and that includes the language function. Working memory can be affected, processing speed of information, inappropriate responses or effect, and inhibitory capacity. Positive symptoms are the common symptoms we think of when we think of schizophrenia. The negative symptoms best be described as a loss of personality and individuality. Different categories depending on the individual and probably underlying genetics, but you usually see a lack of spontaneity and flowing conversation, often stereotyped or rigid thought processes, an active social avoidance, and a diminished social involvement, often out of fear, anxiety, distrust, even of loved ones and good friends. There's a blunted emotional range, diminished emotional responsiveness, facial expression, communicative gestures, a generalized emotional withdrawal, and internalization. There can be a decrease in previous personal interest, a poor rapport or interpersonal relatedness, passive, apathetic social withdrawal, and a passive approach to life in general. Now, turning to the cognitive symptoms, these generally refer to deficits in processing, memory, and abstract reasoning. Conceptual disorganization is common. Disorganized thinking disrupts goals and problem solving. There can be circumstantial or loose associations linked with over-ascribing of meaning to different events that could just be coincidental. Difficulties in abstract thinking with problem solving, disorientation to person, place, time is sometimes present, and there can be posturing with awkward, stilted, disorganized appearance, poor attention with concentration, and distractibility issues that make it difficult to sustain and shift focus, and those probably impact memory formation and the mastery of new information as well. And here comes the kicker. Currently, the medications that are given treat only the positive symptoms, not the negative and not the cognitive. Also, relapse is very common. Over 80% experience a relapse during 5 years after their first episode, and stopping the medication is the single biggest indicator of a relapse. With each relapse, response to treatment is more difficult. Now let's turn towards these two models. And these are models for what's going wrong in the brain, the dopaminergic and the NMDA glutamate models. So with the dopaminergic, that is something that's dealing with the dopamine receptors. And for the past 60 years, the entire field of schizophrenia research has been centered around one single molecule, dopamine. And there are several problems with the dopamine hypothesis. First of all, it assumes that the positive symptoms, mainly psychosis, are the only symptoms in schizophrenia worth treating, because these are the symptoms most associated with the dopaminergic malfunction. As a result, few animal models exist to treat the negative symptoms, and may explain the poverty of pharmaceuticals available for negative symptoms. Now, while some researchers believe the presence of psychosis is the cause of all other negative and affective cognitive symptoms, many voices from the fields of psychotherapy and self-advocacy have come forth to discredit the simplistic view of this disorder. The second problem is that it's simply not enough. Based on the idea, antipsychotics have been the mandatory first line of treatment for schizophrenia for the past 60 years. They are, in fact, the only pharmacological interventions that researchers have ever bothered to evaluate, and yet problems of poor efficacy and life-threatening side effects make antipsychotics some of the most questionable pharmacological interventions to still be approved for use in the United States. More recently, attention's been focused on something called the glutamatergic system, involving agents that block N-methyl D-aspartate, or NMDA for short. Glutamic acid is the major excitatory neurotransmitter in the brain, involving 40% of all the synapses. There are a couple of street drugs, PCP or angel dust, and ketamine, known as the date rape drug, that are known to cause behavior that's closely resembling schizophrenia, and both of these drugs block the NMDA receptors. In fact, the psychosis induced by both PCP and ketamine very closely resembles schizophrenia, because they not only produce positive symptoms, but also the negative symptoms and the cognitive deficits that are so resistant to treatment in schizophrenia. So post-mortem evaluations of the brains of people with schizophrenia have shown that they have fewer NMDA receptors than people who don't have the disease. Both glycine and D-serine, which are NMDA agonists, in other words, they stimulate NMDA, have been found to be decreased in both the blood and the cerebrospinal fluid of people with schizophrenia compared to controls. So, all of this has led to the hypothesis that people with schizophrenia have too little NMDA, and that's one cause of some of the symptoms of the disease, particularly the negative symptoms and the cognitive defects. The NMDA receptor is novel because it requires two neurotransmitters, glycine and glutamate, to activate. It's also novel in that it works in conjunction with other receptors to indicate significance and to create change and learning over time. Dopamine works primarily by innervating the frontal areas of the brain, like the prefrontal cortex, the basal ganglia, limbic system, and if you think about schizophrenia from a dopamine perspective, you think primarily about dysfunction in those brain regions, and people tend not to focus on areas outside of the frontal cortex, things like visual or auditory cortex. But if you think about it from a glutamate or NMDA perspective, NMDA receptors are distributed throughout the brain, so you start thinking of it as a whole brain disorder. So, which model explains schizophrenia? It turns out that both of them may be at play. Another possible cause of schizophrenia in about maybe 1 or 2% of those diagnosed is an autoimmune condition where there are antibodies to NMDA.